You're listening to the Just Japan podcast. Everything you want to know about Japan.
Well, hey there, everyone, and welcome to episode number 144 of the Just Japan podcast, everything you want to know about Japan. My name is Kevin O'Shea, and I am the host of this weekly podcast about all things Japan. That's right, and this week, things are a little bit different. There is no guest this week. Normally, I do have a guest each and every week talking about a different aspect of life in Japan, but I had some serious technical issues earlier on in the week due to a computer upgrade, and therefore, it is just myself this week, flying solo, and that also explains why the episode is late this week. So this week I'll be answering some mailbag questions from Just Japan podcast listeners out there, and so I'll be answering your questions. Next week we'll be back to the regular format where I'm going to have an amazing interview with someone who is in Japan doing some amazing things. So stay tuned for more. So of course you can find the Just Japan podcast in all major podcatchers. Just do a Google search for Just Japan Podcast. We're all over the place. Libsyn, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher Internet Radio, SoundCloud, all over the place. And remember, all of those links can be found in the show notes, the landing pad for the Just Japan Podcast over at justjapanstuff.com. And one thing you may notice when you go over to justjapanstuff.com is that there's a lot more writing over there these days. More blog posts about Japan are going to be popping up. And there's something new that I've been doing with the podcast. As of recording this, we have our first guest blogger on justjapanstuff.com, and there's a great article all about yakisoba. So go check that out. And that's Craig over. He's Writers in Japan over on Twitter, and I want to thank Craig for taking the time to write that great article for justjapanstuff.com. And there are several other people who are going to be writing different articles about Japan, about culture, travel, food, all kinds of stuff. So again, I'm really trying to transform justjapanstuff.com into more than just the landing page for the Just Japan podcast. I'm trying to turn it into a lot more information about Japan itself, some travel, food, fun, pop culture, all kinds of cool stuff. So go over there and check it out. Bookmark that stuff, folks. All right, so this episode will be shorter than others, than normal. And that's simply, well, there's actually a few reasons. First of all, I was sick earlier in the week. It started last weekend, carrying over into earlier in the week. I had a cold, and that carried over into me having some issues with my voice. Now, second issue. I've been having problems with my iPhone for quite some time. I have an iPhone 6s, and the battery was faulty. And I fit the scheme to get a replacement battery for free, because apparently there was, during a certain period of time, a couple of years ago, there were iPhone 6s that were manufacturers that had faulty batteries. So I had to go into the Apple store in Osaka and get my iPhone fixed. But before that, I had to back it up, and I hadn't backed up my iPhone in a long, long time. And to be honest, folks, my MacBook Pro, I bought that back in 2011, and I've never updated it. So I was running macOS Lion. And if it ain't broken, why fix it? And I do all of my interviews for the Just Japan podcast using my MacBook Pro. I use Skype to interview people, and I use a piece of software called Skype Call Recorder, or Call Recorder for Skype. And it works great, very easy to use, good stuff, good quality, good functionality. But the problem is that my OS was too old, my version of iTunes was too old to back up my phone, and there was a possibility that my data would all get wiped when I get it fixed, so I need to back up my phone. So of course I can't back up a 6S on an old Lion computer. So I made quite a leap. I upgraded from macOS Lion all the way to macOS Sierra, which is like many leaps and bounds. So what happened was basically my Skype recording software disappeared, and I couldn't get it to work with the new version of Skype. Well, days later, I finally got that patched up and upgraded, and now it works fine, but the week has come to an end. So I've decided, early in the week, what I decided to do is just put out on Facebook. I said, hey guys, if you got some questions about Japan, I will try my best to answer them in kind of an abbreviated Just Japan podcast episode. And that's what we're going to be doing tonight. And it's going to sound a little bit different from time to time in this podcast because we've got this element that I'm recording in the warmth and comfort of my house in the Just Japan podcast studios. And I think some of the questions that I will be answering, I'll be doing that while I'm on the go, doing it mobilely, in a mobile fashion. That's right. I'll be recording with like a lavalier mic or a lapel mic while I'm out walking. So so some of your questions about Japan will be answered that way. Actually, they all will. Well, the questions that were posed to me. So sit back and listen to me talk about Japan stuff. All right, folks, so it's time to start off the mailbag section for this week's Just Japan podcast. And I'm going to start off with a question by long-time listener of the podcast, Nicholas in Arizona. And Nicholas asked me, are there record shops in your area that sell CDs, vinyls, band t-shirts, music DVDs, and related band merchandise? I miss them old days as a kid back in the 90s when I used to get into record shops with my uncles and aunt. Look at a big selection of music genre CDs, cassettes, vinyls, and related band merchandise. With the rise of digital media making it easier to download music and purchase band merch online, most of these record shops have disappeared. Well, you know what, Nicholas? Japan is a very interesting beast. It's a very different beast culturally, especially when it comes to media consumption and collection. I recently read an article about how Spotify, which was just basically came to Japan early fall, I believe, 2016, and how Spotify, being the famous streaming music service, is having a lot of trouble breaking into the Japanese market because this is a culture where physical media is still king. Just a few years ago, the last time I went back to Canada, I remember walking into a store like Walmart and being really surprised that it was hard to buy blank CDs to copy data on or music. It was almost impossible. I'm sure right now in 2017 that's pretty much near impossible because digital media is king. But here in Japan it's definitely not. Physical media is king. Japanese people prefer to buy CDs, to own CDs. You go to a Japanese person's house, a friend's house, and you'll see that they'll have giant CD collections, massive DVD collections. The idea of digital downloads is something that's almost completely unheard of. And it's actually been the case with me when I've asked someone, when like a DVD is for sale or release, I say, can I get a digital download version of that? They look at me like I've got lobsters crawling out of my ears. They don't quite get what I'm talking about or referring to. So it is definitely a real thing. I mean, I think, some shops are closing down. But for example, Tower Records is still alive and well here in Japan, and you can buy merchandise, and Tower Records is very impressive, and they have huge selections. But there are even smaller indie shops around if you know where to go. If you go to like the kind of like hipper areas of cities, you can find them. Recently, I had to travel from Kobe into Osaka to get my iPhone repaired. And I had to get a new battery put on my iPhone. And so I had to drop it off at the Apple store. And there's only one in the Kansai region, and that's in Osaka. And it's in an area called Shinsaibashi, which is kind of a hipper, cooler area. So I dropped it off at the Apple store, and I had 2 hours to kill. So I just wandered around the neighborhood, and I found probably about a half dozen cool vinyl shops, CD shops, music shops in the area, like where you could buy Nirvana shirts and Mudhoney shirts and Soundgarden gear and all kinds of cool stuff. And they were selling vinyls and they were selling CDs, and really I've even seen shops that sell tapes, cassette tapes. It's pretty cool. It's very retro. Those are, I think even like a shop like that is still somewhat niche, but the bigger shops, again, like Tower Records and stuff, those are still really big, really popular, and they're also really expensive. You're going to pay like about $35 Canadian for a CD. I mean, it's not cheap. But again, Japan is a land where physical media is still alive and well. It's a very big thing. And Nicholas, you'll be happy to hear that those shops are around still in Japan. And although they may have gone the way of the dodo, sadly, in North America, they're around. So that's a very cool thing. All right, so the
The next question for the Just Japan podcast this week comes from Josh Yates, friend of the show, former guest on the Just Japan podcast. And Josh asks me, will you have a podcast hanami this year? And this question was asked over on the Facebook page. You guys should go over and like the Facebook page if you want to really keep in tune with the Just Japan podcast. So will I be having a Facebook hanami party this year? You know what? I got to admit, until Josh sent me this question, I hadn't even thought about it, hadn't even contemplated it. Nothing against it, it just never came to my mind. For those of you who are fans of the podcast, regular listeners, you'll know that back in December, just a couple of months ago, I co-hosted the Japan Podtacular podcast meetup with my friend Mully, Jim Mullins of the Mully's Place podcast. We did that here in Kobe. We had a great little turnout, a lot of awesome people, had a chance to meet some really enthusiastic people about, people who are really into podcasting and fans of podcasting. So that was really great. A hanami party. So for those of you who may not be familiar with hanami is essentially like a cherry blossom parties, which are a very big part of Japanese culture in the spring. The cherry blossoms blooming are a huge sign that spring has arrived here in Japan. And what happens is people tend to have big outdoor parties to celebrate the season. So they go to parks where the cherry trees are blossoming. They set up tarpaulins and they eat delicious food, drink delicious drinks, and have basically fun with friends, coworkers, family, however it may be. So Josh, I never thought of it, but I think it would be a fabulous idea. So I'm going to really put some thought into it. And I think that a Just Japan podcast hanami party might be a great idea. If I were to do it, I would probably maybe not do it in Kobe. It's a little bit off the beaten track for a lot of people who listen to the podcast. It might be a bit more convenient if I hosted a small one in maybe Osaka Castle Park, Osaka Jokoen. That's a very popular place for hanami in the spring, and I think it might be more convenient for people to get to. And I think if I hosted it in Osaka Castle Park, maybe more people would probably attend than if I were to have it in Kobe. And I would try to find a time to not have it on the same day as the YouTube hanami party. I don't do the YouTube hanami thing anymore. I've kind of, got to admit, distanced myself from the whole YouTube thing very intentionally. Podcasting is my thing now, so I would definitely probably want to have it on a different day because there might be some people who would want to attend both. So we'll see. I'll snoop around again. I'm not involved in the YouTube sphere anymore, but I'll poke around and maybe find out when the YouTube hanami is, and maybe then I can set a date according to that, so as to not have it on that day. So it should be a lot of fun. We'll see. I think it's a great idea. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of a setup for me. I just have to basically bring a big blue tarp and, some drinkies, and everyone else bring their drinkies, and we all hang out and talk about Japan and podcasting, enjoy each other's company and all that. So, Josh, great idea. I'll let you know. If I decide to do it, I will set up a Facebook event page for that, and more information will come in future episodes of the podcast. So great question, Josh. You really got me thinking about something I hadn't thought about before.
Okay, so I got a really interesting question from Brandon, and he sent this over to the Facebook page, and he said, I'd really like to hear some great insight about teaching in Japan. I'm going to be in Tokyo again for about a week, for a few days trip, and this is my 6th time in Japan. I even lived there for 3 months and had tons of interviews before, but despite good experience and knowledge and love of Japan, getting a sponsored visa wasn't in the cards, and there are still mostly low-paying positions and or current visa holder only positions. I get the idea that the job market is competitive, but what I don't get is the seemingly improbable obtaining of a visa sponsorship in a decent position. Furthermore, why are so many foreigners in Japan acting like gatekeepers when interviews commence? They seem to often favor wet behind the ears types with no experience. Is this to exploit them with low pay because they are in Japan? I'd really like to hear more about all of this. Okay, Brandon, yeah, that's a really complicated, tricky topic, and it varies in so many different ways. But I hear this frustration from many different people who come to Japan and just they come here trying to find work, and they just simply can't. They have what seems to be all the qualifications on paper. They've got their university degree. They've got some teaching experience maybe in Korea or China or Thailand or back in their own country, and they just can't seem to break into the teaching game here in Japan. And there is often a very catch-22 situation about it. Obviously, to work in another country, you need a work visa. In order to get a work visa, you need to be sponsored by a company in order to get a work visa. But when you look at a website like gaijinpot.com, which is a really big job site here in Japan, they often will have like a little red asterisk by their job saying you must already have a visa. So you can only apply for the job if you already own a visa. And then people who are not in Japan ask themselves, well, how the heck am I supposed to get a visa if I'm not in Japan? It's a catch-22 thing. It's like a dog chasing its tail. So how do I do it? And it is really hard. I don't have an answer to this, really a simple answer. But to make a few points, of course, if you do want to get a job in Japan, teaching, you definitely need to work your hardest to get as much experience as you can beforehand, because it is very competitive. Another thing is, it's not just about coming to Tokyo to find work, because everyone wants to go to Tokyo to find work. You need to be willing to go wherever you can. If it's Hokkaido or Okinawa or anywhere in between, you need to be willing to take a teaching job there. If it's in the countryside, the inaka, as they say in Japan, in the sticks, the boonies, you got to be willing to take that position. You can't be picky, because the companies are so picky. The recruiting agencies are so picky here because they can afford to be. They can afford to be simply because so many people want to come here and teach. It is their market. It's not the teacher's market. It's the school's market. And another thing, and this is sadly true, pay is horrible for English teachers in Japan. It's garbage, absolute trash. The pay for English teachers hasn't basically increased in 30 years in Japan. And the typical pay for an English teacher in Japan will be enough for you to live if you're single and you're frugal and you live in a small apartment and you don't spend a lot or travel a lot. But if, for a typical English teacher pay, I'd say maybe Nijugoman a month, like that's about $2,500 a month when you got to think about your rent, taxes, and all those other things that come out of that. You're not saving a whole lot of money. And to be able to raise a family on a salary like that, absolutely impossible. And so, I mean, people who've been here for a long time, who have families and stuff, they learn how to hustle. And they get many other types of jobs, or eventually they move out of the teaching. A lot of my friends who came here as English teachers, who've been here for a long time, who have families, have moved on beyond the teaching industry. They don't teach anymore. Or maybe they do, they've gotten master's degrees and PhDs and they work in universities now. Or they're just they're in consulting companies and trading companies and different types of businesses. They own businesses, because that's really what you have to do if you want to survive. Now, it is really tough. I mean, I guess you just got to get a lot of experience and get a lot of interviews, and then be willing to go wherever you can go. And then once you get that visa, and maybe you spend a bit of time, a year, working in a place you don't really particularly like, or that wasn't a goal of yours, then maybe once you finish up a year there and get a bit more experience in Japan, you have that visa, maybe then you can move on to something else. That's one route. That's very true. I agree, Brandon, what you mentioned about you seem to suspect that they really want a lot of schools. I think like the big ALT companies like Interac and stuff like that, which are often kind of noted as not maybe having the best job practices, sometimes a bit shady, I've heard, and maybe not the best situations at all, not the best pay by any means, and not always the best conditions, depending on where you are. Big companies like that, I think, do want people who are very wet behind the ears and fresh out of university or college, because those people don't have a lot of life experience. They don't have a professional experience. They don't have much to compare it to, which means maybe they have less to complain about because they simply don't know. Maybe they're very naive when it comes to the pay and the contracts. I know that when I used to teach in Korea years ago, that's exactly what they prefer. The Hagwons back in like the early 2000s really preferred to have people who were very wet behind the ears and didn't have real work experience, because then they could try to mold them and they wouldn't hopefully complain as much because they just didn't have life experience. So they could be kind of bamboozled and fooled and they wouldn't really know, which is really sad, a sad reality, but that was the reality at the time. I'm not sure what it's like there in Korea now, but because I haven't worked there in so many years. So Brandon, tough questions. I have a bit of allergies going on right now. And you will notice that this question moved back inside, not outside. That's because I've been recording this podcast over the span of 3 days. It's been a real challenge to put this kind of short podcast together this week, guys. A real challenge. Next week, though, I've got a great interview lined up. Brandon, great questions. I'm sorry I don't really have a clear answer for you. All I can say is best of luck, Brandon, when you come back to Japan for your interviews. I really do hope you find something. And for all of you guys who are out there, hoping to find work in Japan in the education industry, it's a tough industry to break into. And I got to admit, it's not always the best one, as in like when it comes to pay. But other podcasters have mentioned and other bloggers mentioned it can be a way to get a visa if you can get in there. And once you get here, maybe you can move on to something that, interests you more. So thank you, Brandon, for that really awesome question.
We're sorry, the number you have dialed is not in service at this time.
So there you go, folks. Some questions about Japan and my answers. And I hope you found some of those answers useful, and if not useful, at least quasi-entertaining. So there you go. That's how we kind of do this shorter mailbag episode of the podcast due to health reasons and technical reasons. I want to tell you that next week will be a full-on episode of the Just Japan podcast where I'm going to be interviewing a guest about a really amazing aspect of life in Japan that you're going to really dig and find interesting. Of course, again, my name's Kevin O'Shea. I'm coming to you from Kobe, Japan, and this is episode number 144 of the Just Japan podcast. Go check out justjapanstuff.com. More writing is going there. More cool stuff is going there about the podcast. I should say about Japan. So, of course, the show notes for the podcast will be there. The notes for the weekend Just Japan News podcast will be there, but also a lot of other writing about Japan itself, some by me and some by other amazing folks out there who are contributing to the site. Of course, you can always find me on Twitter at jlandkev. I'm there a lot these days, hanging out over on Twitter. You can find me on Instagram at jlandkev. Come over and like the Facebook page for the podcast. That's facebook.com/justjapanstuff. Lots of news articles posted there daily about Japan. Lots of great news stuff, as well as my Twitter feed over at jlandkev. There's always lots of news links and my ramblings about Japan. So and also about technology and science and other things that I'm interested in. So go like me, follow me over on the Twitter. Come on, guys, do it. Of course, if you have any questions about the podcast, you have any questions about Japan or this or that, you can always email me at justjapanpodcast@gmail.com. And that about does it for another week of the Just Japan podcast. I'm Kevin. I'm here in Japan, and I want to thank you guys for taking the time to listen. You guys are really awesome. You're really amazing. I tell you one thing I plan on doing in the very near future, probably by next week. I'll probably be talking about it in next week's episode, but I'm going to get a new run of Just Japan podcast merchandise out there, some new t-shirts and coffee mugs and stuff with the new Just Japan podcast logo. I've done 2 runs before of merchandise for the Just Japan podcast, and those were with the old logo, so I'm going to get some gear out there with the new logo on it. So that'll be coming down the pipe real soon. I think I'll have more information about that in next week's episode. So of course, stay tuned to next week till next week for another full episode of the Just Japan podcast. And also, in a couple of days on the weekend, you can expect your regular dose of the Just Japan News podcast coming your way, which is basically me covering some of the top news stories coming out of Japan for the week. Well, that does it, folks. Another episode all wrapped up in a nice little bow. My name's Kevin. I'm the host of the Just Japan podcast. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I want to thank you for taking the time to share this podcast on your social media. You are the folks that make this happen. You are the folks that make the podcast grow bigger and bigger. So, of course, when I post this link, please share it on your Facebook, on your Twitter, on your whatever. And it helps a lot. And I appreciate it. So, coming from Japan, I'm Kevin, and wherever you are in the world, I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy. I'll be talking to you again real soon.